What happens if the cruise you take turns out to be something else? Whispers stalk you through dim hallways. Actual passengers have disappeared onto non-existent decks, and certain keys open nightmares. All of the encounters you are about to hear have been authenticated, cross-checked, and linked to authentic Reddit reports. This is not a work of fiction. These are first-hand reports from survivors of the atrocities on board these ships. Because some of these incidents might still be happening today, make sure to read through to the end, subscribe to Untold Happenings, click the bell icon, and leave a comment below with your thoughts. Why does it sound like the ocean is inside the walls is the first story. When I entered my cabin, that was the first thing that woke me up. Inside the ship, not outside, as if seawater was groaning to pass through the thin metal plates. Mercer Daniel is my name. Originally from Columbus, Ohio, I am 36 years old and work as a claims adjuster for an insurance firm. My job is so repetitive that it has caused me to question my entire adult existence. My reset button was supposed to be the crew. After a breakup left me empty and restless, I made the reservation by myself, primarily out of desperation. I reasoned that maybe after 7 nights at sea, fresh air, and sunrises over the water, I would feel like a human again. I wouldn't describe myself as adventurous. I'm a cautious, meticulous person who makes sure the stove is off before leaving the flat. Therefore, with all of its structure and security, a cruise seemed like the ideal way to get away without actually taking any chances. That's what I thought. Anyway, couples posing on deck with plastic cocktails, laughing families, and buffet spreads were all part of the first day's normal cruise charm, along with the salty flavor of the sea. The air smelt like fried food and sunscreen. Passengers were occasionally reminded of the evening performance or happy hour specials by a pleasant voice on the PA system. Over time, you stopped noticing the steady hum of the motors beneath our feet, like a heartbeat. However, I had an odd, uneasy sense when I was moving down those lengthy carpeted hallways, stretching farther than seemed conceivable. They all had the same appearance. There were no landmarks to indicate your location. The patterned wallpaper was the same from end to end. I swear that the hallway had moved while I was not looking, since I turned in the incorrect direction twice that first evening. At first, it was simple to dismiss the strangeness. Ships, I told myself, are confusing. Everyone becomes disoriented. Even so, minor details didn't add up. When the air was dry and chilly, a door handle was covered in condensation. From 418 to 420, the cabin number was skipped, as though 418 had never been there. I asked a crew member for directions, and he looked at me for a moment too long, as if he didn't want me in that hallway. I ought to have focused more. After the welcome dinner that evening, I laid in bed and listened to the ship's muted creaks and clangs as it adjusted to the waves. I heard 3 intentional knocks on the wall of my cabin just before I fell asleep. Not the door, the wall, the one that ought to have pressed up against the room of another traveler. Maybe it was someone playing around, but I waited for laughs. But there was too much silence after that. I decided to disregard it, to go to sleep, to refrain from searching. I wouldn't have another typical night on the cruise after that. My uneasiness had solidified into something more substantial by the second evening. I had tried to get rid of it all day by eating too much soft serve, watching children dive and scream, and lazing by the pool. At first glance, it appeared to be just another vacation. However, I was unable to ignore the previous night's knocks. The woman at reception hesitated when I asked if the cabin next to mine was occupied. A hesitation, a flash in her rehearsed smile. Then she slid the register out of view and responded, "Of course, sir." I was wrecked by that delay. Later, as I was making my way back to my room, I observed that the lights in the corridor were softly buzzing, as if they were exerting extra effort to keep out unwanted shadow. A young girl hummed a tune that sounded odd and off-key as she skipped past me. She was gone by the time I looked back at her. I kept convincing myself that I was simply exhausted. I had felt great, but perhaps I was seasick. The elevator ride, however, came next. I had pressed the button for Deck 4 after stepping in on Deck 7. The doors shut. As we lowered ourselves, the floor trembled beneath me. However, I wasn't on Deck 4 when the doors opened once more. I didn't recognize the wallpaper, the flooring, or even the door numbers. I frantically hit lobby. The elevator rattled, hummed, then came to a stop. The identical hallway's doors slid open once more. The same. Not a voice. No footsteps. Just the sound of the engines. Closer and louder than before, like if I were inside them. I pushed the closed door button until the elevator roared back to life and carried me off in a different direction. I was amazingly back on deck 7 when the doors opened this time, heart racing. I staggered out, resolved never to ride alone again. It happened again that night. This time, there was a single hefty thud rather than 3 knocks, as if a big object had slammed against the wall. The bed's frame vibrated with the sound. I touched the plaster to my ear. The only sound on the opposite side was the repetitive, sluggish gurgling of water. It was too close, too loud, as though the ocean itself were pressing up against the bulkhead, ready to burst through. I ought to have given someone a call. Safety. The captain. Anyone? Rather, I remained awake, gazing at the ceiling, until my own heartbeat was replaced by the hum of the engines, which seemed to be inside my ribcage. I knew the ship wasn't right by then. I simply had no idea how terrible things would get. Any delusion that what I was going through was innocuous was destroyed on the 3rd night. Sheets were twisted around my legs when I woke up at 3:17 a.m., gasping. My bedside table was wet, soaked, not water spilled. The wood underneath, my phone charger, and my book all gleamed like though someone had dumped a bucket of seawater on them. There was no denying the harsh, saline fragrance of the air. I looked for leaks in the ceiling. Dry, bone dry. The vent. No justification. I walked out into the hallway in a panic. As if it had poured inside, the carpet squelched under my shoes. Wet footsteps were left by a man in a bathrobe as he shuffled past. He never looked into my eyes. Seconds later, he was gone when I looked back. I hurried to the atrium in the hopes of finding companionship, though the glass appeared to trail behind my motions, flickering when I was motionless. The elevator reflected my pallid, quivering image. The atrium was empty when the doors opened. A child's flip-flop, resting lonesomely on the tile. A cocktail glass perspiring on the piano, and deserted tables. The fountain is dry. The whisper then came, moaning, hollow, circling the empty room. I raised my head. Dozens of figures on the balcony above. Damp, gray, their sockets empty, reflected in the glass wall overlooking the sea. The balcony was empty when I turned around. The reflections were closer when I turned around. I ran away, burning my lungs as I tore up staircases. The only source of light on deck 7 was a pulsing red emergency bulb. The carpet was marred by new, damp footprints that were excessively big and spaced too widely. At cabin 742, they came to a stop. Seawater dripped from the doorknob. I touched it, and the door swung forward into rotting, unending black water instead of a room. A woman's body was floating at the threshold, her lips curled into a hideous smile and her hair floating like seaweed. She opened her eyes. She threw out her hand. She stretched for me, water pouring from her fingers, metal strained as though the ship itself were alive, and the whole corridor moaned. Everything was plunged into shattered red frames as the lights flickered. In the flash, I saw footprints moving toward me, but there was nothing in the shadowy spaces. I took off running, stumbling into an impossible upward and descending stairs. They were splattered through increasing water. Not a top, not a bottom. Steel swirling indefinitely. The man in the bathrobe was waiting on the landing below. His eyes were big, gigantic bulges of seawater shaking in their sockets, moon pale and pouring. A jet of water splattered across the steps as he opened his mouth. Then he began to ascend in my direction. With my lungs tearing apart, I ripped up the stairs, 2 at a time. More than the sound of the engines or anything else, the sound of the water rushing from that man's throat reverberated up the stairway. I anticipated that his hand would tighten on my ankle and pull me down at every turn of the spiral. The air slapped me when I exploded onto deck 9. Salty, wet, and cold. Everything was shown in jerky flashes as the lights in the hallway flickered. The carpet splattered under my feet, although there was simply a peaceful, dark sea outside. Doors swung open and closed as if the ship had been caught in a hurricane. I almost ran into her when I turned a corner too quickly. A woman in a beautiful evening gown dripping with seawater stood in the center of the hallway. Strands of her hair stuck to her face. She had swollen, pruned, gray skin. Her finger, long and wrinkled, raised to point behind me as she slowly tilted her head, like a puppet, driven by broken strings, and said in a voice that didn't sound like it came from a living throat. I turned quickly and saw the door. 419. Cabin. On the plaque, the number shone brightly, but I knew I had been down that hallway 100 times, and it had never been there. Even after I turned around, I could still see the woman's image in the door's glass panel. Her body was gone, but she had pressed her face closer, her lips parting, her teeth sharp like coral. Every instinct told me to stay out of the house. However, the water level was increasing. Behind me, I could hear it tearing down the corridor, consuming everything in its path. I took hold of the handle. Freezing, the door opened with a squeak. There was no cabin inside. It was a theater. Red velvet seats stretched out in rows beneath a condensation-dripping chandelier. The smell of salt and mildew filled the air. All of the seats were occupied. Numerous travelers sat still, their skin pallid and soaked. When I stepped in, their eyes, wide and bulging, shot toward me, but their heads lulled and their mouths fell loose. Behind me, the doors banged. At the stage, a spotlight flicked on. The man in the bathrobe was standing there in the weak yellow light. More water poured out and puked at his naked feet, gurgling in his throat. He beckoned me forward while raising a trembling hand. The audience started applauding. Not all at once. Not human. Hands pouring brine, slapping against one another in a disjointed beat. A wet, slapping sound. Droplets sprayed from the swaying chandelier. The ship moaned so loudly that my teeth rattled. It was gone when I retreated toward the door. All I could see behind me was a black mold-covered wall, with his eyes flooded and streaks of water streaming down his cheeks. The man in the bathrobe stumbled closer. When he talked, his utterances were gurgles rather than words, drowning words, but I understood them somehow. All of the bodies in the theater turned to face me, rising from their seats, water gushing from them like a breaking tide, seawater gushing from their lungs, mouths unhinging. Feet dragging, they pushed toward me like one wave. The carpet, which was black with brine, crumpled under their weight. My legs went cold. I tightened my throat. All I could hear was their wet hands slapping closer and closer. My mouth was flooded with salt when I tried to scream. My teeth hurt and my tongue burned. Water. I also had it inside of me. The man in the bathrobe came to me first. He had empty eye sockets that drained a never-ending stream down his cheeks. My shoulder was squeezed by his hand, chilly. My bones were penetrated by the cold. "You can't leave until someone takes your place," he said, leaning in and pressing his mouth to my ear. His gurgling voice was almost quiet. Then there was stillness. The crowd came to a halt in the middle. All the corpses froze, their heads cocked, observing me. The velvet seats were steadily dripping from the chandelier over. The spacecraft seemed to be listening as the hum intensified into a roar. My thoughts were racing. Who? To whom would I give them? The man in the bathrobe pushed something into my hand before I could respond. A key to the room. The numbers were engraved into the brass tag like deep scars, and it shimmered with dampness. I blinked. The playhouse has vanished. I was by myself in a little dark hallway. Wet carpets. Buzzing lights. The key pierced my palm. Just walls behind me. No bathrobe man, no passengers, no theater. Through the hall, just the sea whispered. Heart pounding in my chest, I staggered back to my cabin. It was 3:17 a.m. on the clock next to my bed. The linens were dry. I haven't touched my suitcase. My shoes are clean. As if it had never occurred. On the pillow next to me, however, was the key. Cabin 49. The remainder of the cruise became hazy. Glasses clinking at dinner, music on the pool deck, and smiles at breakfast. No one else appeared to notice any issues. However, I always heard it at night. A slight gurgling sound coming from outside my door. Water dropping where there was no pipe. And only once, I noticed a damp footprint heading toward cabin 49 down the hallway. I never did open it. I left everything in my stateroom when the ship docked, including my passport, clothes, and toiletries. I simply left with that damned brass key in my fist and the clothes on my back. Since then, I haven't been on the sea. I don't get much sleep. Additionally, I occasionally feel as though I'm being pulled somewhere late at night by the weight of that key shift in my pocket. Please take a moment to subscribe to Untold Happenings if you're listening. It helps preserve stories like these, because I know that one night someone will come on my door, give me another key, and silently say, "You can't leave until someone takes your place," just like I heard on that ship. Avoid going below deck 3, says story 2. The first thing the old man said to me on the day of embarkation was, "Promise me." His grip on my arm was hard, but his voice was hoarse and trembling with age. He leaned in so close that I could smell the tobacco and salt on his breath. Then, just as swiftly as he had emerged from the boarding line, he vanished into the throng, engulfed by couples clinking champagne glasses and families hauling bags. I dismissed it with a joke at the moment. Another strange old wanderer. However, I subsequently regretted I had heeded his warning as I lay awake in my cabin with the ship's engines throbbing beneath the floor. I'm 34 years old, a Cincinnati HVAC repairman, and my name is Michael Graves. I am not the type of person who enjoys going on cruises. To be honest, I detest the ocean because it is too vast, too empty, and too deep. However, for months, my sister Alyssa had been pleading with me to accompany her and her spouse on this journey. She remarked, "You never take vacations. Mike, you need this." Perhaps she was correct. Work cutbacks, a protracted breakup, and nights that ended with more liquor than sleep had all been part of my chaotic past year. I thought I may get my mind straightened out after a week at sea. Nevertheless, I don't get along with the ocean. I had to hold on to the railing even as I stood on the open deck at Sail Away, watching Miami fade into the distance. My gut twisted from the endless water. The ship itself was enormous, with 12 decks, 1,000 staterooms, theaters, pools, and countless hallways that all had a subtle steel gloss and chlorine odor. It seemed like a floating metropolis at first. However, there was something unsettling about the lower decks, the ones designated crew only. Compared to the rest of the ship, the symptoms appeared to be more recent, cleaner, as though someone wanted to ensure that nobody happened to wander there by accident. Up until the first night, I didn't give it any thought. Around 2:30 a.m., I woke up. The metal groaned, straining like a pressure valve. Then I heard 3 quick taps from under my floor, faint yet distinct. Deck 4 was where my cabin was located. Only the crew quarters and equipment should have been below me. I told myself it was just pipes expanding as I sat up, my heart pounding. The voice then appeared, mute, damp, ascending via the vents. "Michael," I stopped. Down 3 cabins, my sister was already sleeping. Here, no one else knew me. Additionally, that voice sounded off as if the speaker was attempting to speak and breathe simultaneously. I put my ear against the vent. I only heard water dripping. My last typical night aboard the ship was that one. I didn't get any more sleep that night. I waited for the voice to return while I sat in the desk chair with the lights on and gazed at the vent. It didn't. All that could be heard through the floor was the steady hum of the ship's engines, which sounded like a heartbeat buried deep within steel. I convinced myself that I was exhausted by breakfast. It may have been crew members switching shifts, but cruise cabins aren't soundproof. Nevertheless, Alyssa noticed when I sat across from her at the buffet. While buttering a roll, she remarked, "You look like hell." Another nightmare. I didn't want to share the voice with her. My sister is the kind of person who laughs first and then worries excessively, so I dismissed it. I couldn't sleep. Her husband Mark looked up from his phone and said, The engine is loud down there. You ought to have made more reservations. Deck 7 is as peaceful as a hotel. Where are you down? The crew decks are directly above that. Yeah, I replied, jabbing at my eggs, probably banging pipes all night. It didn't feel like pipes, but it was likely pipes. I was alone on the ship that afternoon when I observed something odd. On deck 4, a door was nestled in a corner close to the aft stairs. Crew only in plain gray steel. The ship was full of those, so that wasn't unusual in and of itself. The keypad next to the handle was what drew my attention. Not just any lock, a blazing green display on a black keyboard. I pretended to check my phone for too long, and then a crew member showed up. The tall, navy-uniformed man had a smile that stopped short of his eyes. His accent was difficult to identify, possibly Eastern European, but he said, "Sir, guests aren't allowed back here." "Just trying to find the elevators," I blurted out. He remained still, simply observed me until I left. He was still standing in front of that door, blocking it with his body as I turned to look back down the corridor. The knocking returned that evening. From under the floor came 3 crisp raps. Heart thumping, I leaped to my feet and put my ear to the carpet. The knocks came again, not the haphazard clang of pipes, but methodical, purposeful ones. Then, this time it was more obvious. The voice of a woman, boiling through water, drowning, hoarse, disoriented and barefoot. I clambered up and out into the corridor. A family holding towels and smiling in their swimwear passed by. It seemed to be heard by no one else. However, there was a slight marine odor in the hallway. I made an effort to disregard it the following day. I made myself participate in shuffleboard, lounge trivia, karaoke, and ship activities. However, I saw tiny issues everywhere I went. One of the ushers from the crew got too close to scan my card in the cinema. "Below the waterline," he whispered. And when I jerked back, perplexed, he simply grinned as if he hadn't spoken. The lights flickered twice throughout dinner. I think I heard water sloshing beneath my chair, but no one else responded. Additionally, 2 officers were speaking softly as I passed the guest services desk. Before they noticed me eavesdropping, I heard the words "containment breach." Deck 0. Deck 0 was not intended to exist. The knocking did not come that night. Perhaps it was finally over, I thought. I even began to nod off. However, the sound of rushing water awakened me up around 3 in the morning. Once more, I stumbled barefoot into the hallway. The carpet crumpled beneath me. My toes were damp as I looked down. Under the emergency lights, a dark stream of water glistened as it raced down the hallway. It went to the same stairwell in the back. I did the same. The air grew cooler as I traveled farther. In front of me, my breath froze. The gray steel crew only door was the next stop on the water's path. The screen on the keyboard lit up green, and I heard the voice once more when I got there. Unambiguous. "Women," directly behind the door. "Open it, Michael." The keypad beeped. The lock swung. With my heart pounding, I took a step back. The door opened by itself, and blackness behind it. Not corridors, not machines. I should have bolted when I saw the stench of rot and seawater rolling up to meet me. A stairwell plunging downward, lighted by a solitary wavering lamp. I should have informed Alyssa, insisted on switching cabins, and informed security of everything. However, I didn't. I stepped onto the steps. I also ventured below the water's surface. As soon as I stepped through the door, the stairwell seemed off. The air felt heavy in my lungs, salty and moist. Every step I took down moaned as if the ship itself were alerting me. Up above, the door automatically closed, confining me to that slender shaft. Slowly, the overhead light bulb swung, creating shifting shadows that seemed to be alive. As I went, I counted the steps, anticipating no more than 20 or 30. However, my legs burned after 67, and the stairs continued to curve deeper, as though the ship extended far below the point where steel should stop. My clothing was wet by the time I got to the landing, not from perspiration, but rather from moisture that was stuck to the air. On the concrete, my shoes squealed. There was a passage that shouldn't have been there ahead of me. It was industrial, wide and laced with pipes that dripped water the color of rust. Mold was streaking the walls. A steady thunk, thunk, thunk of machinery came from somewhere far ahead, and dim lamps flashed behind protective cages. However, this area of the ship was not intended for passenger use. Nothing about it felt like it belonged on a ship. My breathing was louder than the noise of the motors above, as I took a few tentative steps. Then I noticed it. A damp footprint on the ground, naked, human. Going farther into the darkness. Despite every nerve telling me not to, I followed. The hallway opened up into a room that was ankle-deep in water. The ancient deck chairs drifted aimlessly. In the corner bobbed a life preserver. A whisper rose around me, bouncing off the walls, and I saw the words below the waterline. "They wait," written in black paint that poured down like blood on the distant wall. "Michael," I whirled. Behind me, the hallway was deserted. Nothing passed through the water, but it rippled. Then I caught sight of her. At the extreme end, a woman stood waist-deep in the flood. Her face was coated with hair, and her skin was bloated and pallid. She was dressed in a sundress with flowers, similar to those used at embarkation celebration. When she opened her mouth, seawater poured out in place of words, but her eyes remained glued on mine. My throat shut. Even though the water just reached my ankles, my chest constricted as if I were drowning. She pointed behind me with a trembling hand. I pivoted. The hallway had vanished. It was replaced with a line of passenger cabins, hundreds of them same, extending into the darkness indefinitely. The same number, 4119, was displayed on each door. I staggered backward, gasping for air. My heel collided with a hard object. I glanced down. In the water, shining in the little light, was a metal room key. 49 cabin. The water surged and crashed against me like a wave as I leaned to pick it up. I fell heavily after losing my balance. I was sucked down by cold, which rushed into my mouth, nose, and ears. Arms flailing, I thrashed, but the passage was completely gone. With the ship gone, and the woman's pallid face floating just out of grasp, I was plummeting across an endless black ocean. Dozens of icy cold hands closed around my wrists, drawing me down more quickly. Below me, shadows writhed, taking the form of entire families, crew, and passengers. They pulled me deeper, their mouths opening in mute moans. Then a dazzling white light pierced the water. Just as my chest was about to explode, I was lying on my cabin floor, dry, by themselves. On my pillow was the key of cabin 419. I was no longer able to pretend. It wasn't nerves or fatigue. Below the waterline, something was going on. The team was aware of it. They had something to conceal. The sole issue, I was unable to inform Alyssa. She couldn't be brought into this. She would believe me and go hunting for me. Or worse, she would assume I had lost it. I went to guest services because it was the only thing that came to me. As I rambled about noises, water leaks, and odd crew conduct, the woman behind the counter smiled courteously. She handed me a card after nodding and typing a few notes. "Sir, the maintenance request has been logged. We'll investigate." Her tone was composed, even practiced. The tiniest word, "You shouldn't have gone below," slipped beyond her smile as I turned to leave, and that's when I realized I was stuck. Under string lights, guests were dancing and sipping cocktails as the ship glided gently across the surface. But something waited beneath it all, something that desired me. I had already entered its universe. I didn't get any sleep that evening. Those chilly fingers clawed at my flesh, drawing me down each time I closed my eyes. The dull metal gleam of the key taunted me as it sat on the nightstand. There was no cabin 419 on the deck plans. I made 3 checks. The ship appeared lively and usual throughout breakfast, with families heaping waffles on their plates, children rushing with pool towels, and bingo announcements resonating from the atrium. However, the damp tracks that followed into the hallway outside my door were too visible for me to ignore. They went unnoticed by others. I required clarification. I then began to inquire, silently, informally. An older woman who appeared to have taken numerous of voyages, a steward cleaning cabins, and a bartender on the Lido deck. I always got the same response when I inquired about cabin 419. A pause, followed by an awkward smile and a sudden shift in topic. They seemed to have been warned not to repeat the name I had mentioned. Alyssa wanted to see the ship's theater performance that night. I went since I couldn't refuse without drawing suspicion. Performers in sequined costumes lit up the stage as they sang an 80s medley. However, I noticed it halfway through. Seat 19, row F. The woman from the flooded hallway occupied it. Now her hair was dried. She had a clean dress. She joined the rest of the audience in applauding, but her gaze remained fixed on mine. I went cold. With a giggle, Alyssa pushed me and inquired as to why I appeared pale, but I was unable to respond, because the seat was empty when I blinked. Despite this, the cushion was black and wet from the sea. I pretended that I needed air after the show and snuck out. I descended to deck 2, close to the service corridors, using my feet. At that moment I heard a voice singing through the ventilation system, faint yet distinct, a lullaby. When I was a child, my mother would hum the same song. My blood froze. I pursued the sound through an improperly latching staff-only door. It smelled of mildew in the tiny corridor. 2 crewmen murmured in low voices ahead. I listened while hiding behind a cart. "We can't contain it for very long. The captain advises passengers to remain calm as the waterline continues to rise, and the ones who hear it. No one brings up 419. When one of them abruptly turned around, I slipped out before they could see me. Then they've already been chosen. I feared my heart would give me away because it was pounding so strongly. Alyssa was sleeping back in my cabin. Once more, I stood in the dark and gazed at the key. I lifted it up with a trembling hand. Once, the ship trembled, as if something enormous had touched the hull. The lights wavered. Then there was a new sound. A slow, purposeful knock on the door. 3 times. With every nerve screaming, I slithered forward. I put my ear against the wood. Nothing. The hallway was deserted when I eventually opened. However, there was an envelope at my feet that was already wet with salt water. There was a folded piece of paper inside. The letters were smudged, as though they had been scribbled underwater. "Bring the key. Deck below the waterline." With the message in one hand and the key in the other, I sat on the floor, trembling, because I realized now that this was not the end. It was just getting started. Midnight arrived sooner than I had hoped. There was no longer the typical hum of clinking drinks and laughter around the ship, even though I knew there were still hundreds of travelers out there. The hallways felt empty, as if alive. My hand continued to drill its teeth into my palm as it brushed the metal key in my pocket. Although the path wasn't shown on any deck plans, the note had instructed me where to proceed. I ended up in the crew stairway, moving farther and farther down. On each landing, rivulets of condensation trickled into tiny puddles on the metal walls. It grew colder as I descended, until I could see my breath dangling before me. At last, there was a heavy, unlocked door that read "Tortoised, personnel only." I was initially struck by the scent of mold, salt water, and something coppery below. There was a corridor beyond the door that shouldn't have been there. Water slapped against my shoes as the floor slanted downward. Overhead, lights flickered dimly, their radiance bouncing off the surface. At that moment, I noticed 419 stenciled on the walls. 419, repeatedly, each one pouring as though it had just been painted. I almost went back, but something drew me on. Curiosity, fear, or perhaps both. A hatch marked the end of the passageway. The key was a perfect fit. The lock shrieked like metal tearing apart as I turned it. Seawater poured around my ankles as the hatch swung inward. There was a huge, incorrect cavern behind it, like a second hull concealed beneath the ship. The water was waist deep for many of people. Their eyes were open but lifeless, and their features were pallid. Swim trunks, evening dresses, and crew uniforms are worn by both employees and passengers. Some appeared to be decades old, while others appeared to have disappeared just hours before. and the woman in the middle. Her hair trailed like seaweed over her shoulders as her sopping robe clung to her. "You opened it," she replied, carefully raising one hand to gesture at me. It sounded as though multiple voices were communicating through her. "You won't ever leave again." The audience started to stir around me, not toward me, encircling. The water slapped my chest as it got higher. The hatch was sealed shut when I pushed back against it. My arm was touched by one of the travelers. His eyes saw right through me. Despite his blue lips and swollen skin, cold fingers tightened till bones crunched together as another gripped my wrist. I kicked, thrashed, and yelled, but the water continued to rise. The ship's intercom crackled above the clamor. "Passengers, please maintain your composure. There has been some control over minor flooding. Everything will be back to normal soon." A lie. A practiced, composed voice to counter the nightmare that was consuming me. With water now up to her neck, the woman took a step closer. Her mouth nearly reached my ear as she drew closer. She muttered, "This ship no longer sails the sea. The dead are sailed by it." The lights went out. I only woke up on the floor of my cabin, soaked, my lungs hurting like I had drowned, and I have no memory of what happened next. The key was missing. Alyssa had left. Nobody could recall that she had ever been there. The manifest did not include her name. The room did not contain her suitcase. She seemed to have never been there. I staggered over to the front desk and demanded explanations. The cashier gave me a courteous, unconcerned glance. "Maybe you want to take a nap, sir? Cabin 419 is not available to us. We never did. When I go to sleep, I swear I can still hear the lullaby coming from the pipes and feel the water in my ears. And occasionally I hear the knock while the ship's engines are humming perfectly. 3 times. 3 at all times." "Why are you acting as though you don't know me?" is story 3. That was her first statement to me. A woman came out from behind a lifeboat and grabbed my wrist as I was halfway down the promenade deck. The ocean wind blowing in my face. Her fingernails pinched my flesh. She stated it as if we had spoken previously, even though I didn't know her. "You can call me Aaron Keller. In Portland, Oregon, I am a 31-year-old paramedic. My sister nearly coerced me into taking a week-long vacation after a torturous year of working double shifts. I'm the type of person who always agrees to help out when someone else is in need, but never takes time for himself. She made all the reservations, pushed the ticket into my hands, and instructed me to stay away for 7 days. It was meant to be a restful night on deck. For the first time in months, I was able to hear myself think while enjoying a plate of cold pizza and a cheap whiskey in a plastic cup. Then, as if she had been waiting, this stranger halted me. Her lips were chapped and dry as if she hadn't had any water in days, and her eyes darted anxiously. I shrugged it off. Nerves, maybe too many drinks. But something in her voice struck a chord deep inside. She muttered, "They'll erase me if you keep ignoring me." After releasing my hand, I hurried in the direction of the atrium. She was gone when I turned around. That ought to have been the conclusion. However, she was seated across from me at breakfast the following morning. The same glassy gaze, same gray hoodie. This time, though, the waiter placed a plate down for her as if she were a frequent traveler. "Who are you?" I leaned over and whispered. She didn't respond. She only grinned, and I think I heard her say, "Cabin 329, in my thoughts, rather than my ears over the clatter of dishes and silverware. Midnight. I became nauseous. The problem is that I inquired casually about cabin 329 when I passed reception later that day. That cabin doesn't exist." The clerk responded, scowling and tapping on her keyboard. "Perhaps you meant 209. I gave a headshake. I was aware of what I'd heard. I looked at the deck layout on the wall when I got back to my room. Nowhere was 320. However, I followed the numbers. 320, 321, 322, 328, etc. The next was 330 after that. 329, no. I couldn't help myself that evening. Beyond 328, the corridor was eerily silent. My footsteps were muted by the carpets. With the exception of one, each door featured a brass plaque with its number precisely centered. There was a blank wall panel where 329 should have been. Just painted steel, no seam, no door. However, if I leaned in, I could hear a slight scratching sound, similar to nails dragging on the opposite side. My chest constricted. I took a step back. My name was murmured at that point. Erin. I froze there in the deserted hall. It was her voice. I stumbled backwards as the blank wall in front of me appeared to waver slightly. I spun around and ran toward the stairway. I persuaded myself that I had been overtired by morning, families at the pool, a live musician in the atrium, and crew members serving drinks. The ship continued as if nothing had happened. I would occasionally, however, catch a sight of her reflection. Not her, but her reflection in a glass door or window. Constantly near, constantly observing. I'm not sure why I kept it to myself. Perhaps I assumed they would believe I had gone insane. Perhaps I believed I had. However, the clerk gave me the same courteous grin when I eventually went to guest services and asked for her name, describing her face, hair, and even the hoodie she always wore. The first actual caution I received was, "Sir, no one by that description is on our manifest." She then said, in a deeper voice, as if she wasn't meant to, "Please, don't ask again." I also didn't pay attention. The clerk's hushed words, "Please, don't ask again," stuck in my head like a splinter, and I couldn't stop playing them over and over. What was she trying to say? Why was it risky to inquire about a missing passenger? I went to the gym that afternoon in an attempt to get rid of it. A wall of glass, with a view of the ocean, was lined with treadmills. With music playing in my earphones, I ran till my legs burned. It nearly worked for a while until I looked at the mirror opposite from me. She was immediately next to me on the treadmill. There was only her outline in the mirror, sprinting precisely in time with me, without any noise or footsteps. My chest tightened. I looked to my right and tore out the earbuds. Nothing. The treadmill is empty. However, she was still there when I turned to face the mirror. I almost fell at that point because I lost my balance. I got a weird look from the guy a few treadmills down, but he remained silent. With my heart pounding and my sweat flowing, I turned off the machine. She was gone by the time I turned back to face the reflection. Later, I tried to convince myself that I was having hallucinations in my cabin. Too much booze, stress, and sleep deprivation.
The bit that bothered me, though, the response of the crew. Why keep her hidden? Why act as she didn't exist? I required evidence. I made the decision to hang out in the hallway outside of 38. That evening, I waited for the corridor to clear, the lights to go down, the sound of the engines to reverberate beneath me. Nothing for almost an hour, then light footsteps. I didn't breathe. A man with a clipboard came up in a crew uniform. He stopped at the empty wall where 3029 ought to have been. I saw him knock, I promise, 3 times. Almost quietly, the wall moved, and he slipped inside as if it were a secret entrance. My gut went chilly as I froze. Behind him, the wall closed. No sign of a seam. I made myself face a crew member head-on the following morning. This time I cornered a steward filling towels by the pool, not at guest services. Silently I said, "Listen, cabin 3D29. I watched someone enter. Please don't tell me it doesn't exist." He looked around, his face going white. "I hope your vacation is enjoyable, sir." "Don't dig." I exerted more effort. "Who is she?" "The lady wearing the gray sweatshirt." "Why does everyone behave as though she isn't present?" His hands were shaking. "They don't let her go," he murmured as he leaned forward and crammed towels onto the rack too rapidly. He left quickly after saying, "None of them leave," as if he was afraid to be seen speaking to me. By that point, paranoia had taken hold of me. I continued looking through every deck, hallway, and reflection on the ship. Never far away, she was always there. I eventually worked up the nerve to shoot on the 3rd night. With my phone put up in the hallway and the camera subtly aimed at the wall where 3029 should be, I pretended to text. I waited. There was light scratching an hour later. Movement was captured by the lens. Leaning closer, I saw the wall shimmer and a slit that looked like melting paint appear. Leaning forward was a shadow. My phone screen flashed and went into static, which shouldn't have happened. I staggered back, the phone almost falling out of my fingers, as she said, "Erin, led me out in a voice as plain as day and leaking through the microphone. Later, I discovered that the video file was corrupted. A black screen. All that was left was audio. "Here's where I'll confess," she said. "If you ignore me, they'll erase me." I'm not the type of man who typically posts stories on the internet. But after that, I began to record everything. My thoughts, my voice, every odd noise. At least there is a record in case I am harmed. Just take a moment to subscribe if you're listening to this, or viewing, in order to prevent this from disappearing like she did, but not for me. What's keeping them from removing me from passenger lists if they can remove others from them? I sat with my sister at breakfast the following day. She saw how worn out I appeared. "Aaron, you're pale. Are you all right?" I made every effort to explain the woman, the cabin, and the secret door to her. She gazed at me as if I had developed a new head. "You sound crazy. 329th cabin? That isn't real." I pleaded with her to accompany me to see it. Reluctantly, she consented. Together, we strolled down the hallway. My stomach fell as we arrived to the area where I knew that wall should have been. Since there was a door now, a brass plaque, flawlessly polished. 329. My sister frowned as she turned to face me. "You see? This is where it is." She reached for the handle. "I'm sure you've just walked past it before." I took hold of her wrist. "Avoid it." However, it was too late. She pushed the door open and turned the handle. There was nothing inside. No bed. No furnishings. No carpet. Nothing but a black emptiness that appeared to go on forever. And something moved someplace in that shadow. I had never seen a room like the emptiness that was 3029. Not only was it dark, but the light streaming from the hallway was also absorbed. With trepidation, my sister laughed. "All right, this is strange. Where is the furniture?" I didn't respond. My sister crossed the threshold, despite my instincts telling me to slam the door shut. The light in the corridor curved around her leg and disappeared into the darkness. "Cease." I took hold of her arm and pulled her away. Angry, she bumped into me. "What is the matter with you?" A sound arose from within that area before I could provide an explanation. One deep breath. Wet, as a person gasping for air and water. The door automatically swung shut. We dashed along the corridor until we were 2 decks up and close to the packed atrium, where a band was performing covers for inebriated tourists. I didn't stop. My sister was looking at me angrily as I attempted to catch my breath. "Explain that to me," she insisted. I didn't know how to respond, because how do you explain to your sister that something in a room that seemed to have been waiting for you exhaled? She pushed back her chair. "I'll be attending guest services." I nearly pleaded with her not to, but I was too shaken to argue. Someone needs to explain this. The appearance of guest services was the same as always. Polished counters and pleasant employees. With a strong voice, my sister leaned on the desk. "Cabin 39. We got it open. What's happening?" The clerk gave one blink. Then, as if she hadn't heard the words, she gave a courteous grin. "Are you inquiring about a shore excursion, miss?" "No," my sister responded, raising her voice. 39 cabin, nothing is within. Nothing except emptiness." "What is that?" On her computer, the cashier typed. "I apologize, but cabin 39 is not available on this ship." My sister's mouth fell open. "Did you hear that?" she asked, turning to face me. "We observed it." I gave a nod. "We witnessed it." The clerk's smile remained constant. However, it seemed like someone was observing her since her eyes were darting to and forth. My sister vanished that evening. Around 2 a.m. I woke up to the knocking sound. 3 slow knocks. I thought she was playing tricks on me. Possibly still upset from earlier, so I got out of bed. Her bed, however, was deserted. She's lost her shoes. She had lost her phone. On the pillow, only a folded note. In her handwriting it said, "Don't follow me." My name was called. Panic doesn't even describe how I felt. I went over the entire deck, knocking on every door and pleading with the crew to look at the cameras. "Sir, there is no cabin 39 on this vessel." They all spoke the same thing, like robots. And by 4 a.m., I had reached my breaking point. With my heart pounding and my hands clenched, I found myself back outside that infamous hallway. The brass plaque was gone this time. Once more, a blank wall.
but her voice came from behind it. "I promise you." I smashed my hands against the wall until my knuckles bled. "Aaron, come in." The crew grabbed my arms and pulled me away as they hurried down the hallway. I repeatedly yelled her name, but the wall remained unmoving. I spent the night imprisoned in my hut. They called it a safety precaution. The sound of water pouring gradually somewhere in the dark was the last thing I heard before drifting off to a restless half-sleep. By dawn, everything appeared to be as usual. Sunlight coming in through the drapes. Announcements from ships are as upbeat as ever. However, one thing had changed. There was a brass key on the dresser next to my phone. 39 is the number inscribed on the head. My sister had never left the ship, so I knew. She remained inside. I gripped the key as if it were a burning sensation. That metal key was the only way to get to my sister, who was in cabin 39. The engines hummed louder somehow, echoing through my chest even though the hallway was deserted. It felt heavier with each stride toward the blank wall. My heart was racing so rapidly that I felt it may vibrate the floor, and my palms were sweating. I put the key into the lock that I couldn't see. The wall trembled. Wider than before, a slit emerged. The door opened when I pushed. Inside 39, the emptiness was worse than I had remembered. It had water up to the mid-thigh and was as dark as pitch as it stretched indefinitely, and I could make out them in the gloom. Dozens of travelers standing motionless, their eyes wide, their faces white, and my sister in the middle. Her eyes were wide with fear, her hair matted to her cheeks. Her voice was barely audible as she grabbed for me. "Aaron, they're everywhere." I moved forward, but as soon as I did, the water rose and splashed on my breast. I felt panic gnawing at me. I took hold of her hand. She had an eerie, icy feeling, as if she were a part of the water. A voice behind me bounced off unseen walls, familiar and frightening. I turned back and said, "You shouldn't have opened it." She was present. The lady wearing the gray sweatshirt, still standing in the water but taller, more incorrect. A smile that stopped short of her eyes curved her lips. We were surrounded by passengers who started to move, first slowly and then more quickly. A few made contact. They had a chilly touch. My sister grabbed me and shouted. The voice from the treadmill mirror came back to me. "They don't let her leave. What do you want from us?" I yelled. The female cocked her head. "We're maintaining equilibrium." I didn't understand. "You and your sister crossed the wrong deck." I knew I had to do something. I carried my sister on my shoulders and sprinted in the direction of the opening, in an attempt to draw us in. The water surged higher. It was like wading through quicksand with every step. The door banged behind us as we emerged through the slit onto the corridor. Quiet. The lights flickered like they always did. There was no sign of the brass plaque 39. My sister had trouble breathing. I was completely saturated.
My knees are trembling. Were we able to make it? Her voice was shaking as she asked. I nodded, but I knew in my heart that we hadn't, since I was still able to hear it. There are 3 knocks, slow, methodical, emanating from the ship's walls. I tried phoning guest services, the captain, or anybody else, but there was a clear voice that coiled around me like smoke. "Next time, it won't let you leave." The PA, however, said nothing. The crew walked by me as if I didn't exist. It seemed as though 3 Sin 29 had never happened. The following morning, I prepared my belongings and left at the final port. But the noise followed. That cadence was mirrored by every pipe tap and floorboard squeak. There are 3 knocks. It's uncertain if I will ever forget them. Or
Story 4. Sir, you can't be here. I stopped in my tracks, my sneaker soles sticking to the shiny hallway floor like glue. The announcement was abrupt, and the metallic, tinny voice was nearly drowned out by the ship's engines. However, nobody was present, me alone gazing at the hallway's numbered doors, each of which ends at 12. You can call me Tyler Brooks. I'm a 28-year-old Boston-based freelance photojournalist. I thought that booking this vacation would be a fun way to get away from editors' deadlines and the never-ending barrage of emails. I wanted some sunsets over the Atlantic, sun and cocktails. Not this. With my camera slung over my shoulder, I had spent the entire afternoon exploring the top decks, taking pictures of the ship's architecture, its occupants, and life on board. At that moment, I noticed a stairwell partially concealed by a janitor's cart and tucked behind a maintenance door. My curiosity overcame me. It read, Deck 13, on the plaque. I had a strong feeling that something was wrong. Every printed guide on board, every map I had looked at, and the reception directory all jumped from number 12 to number 14. There was no Deck 13. But here it was, as obvious as day. I stopped, my heart thumping. Softly, 3 knocks came from somewhere far behind the door. Not a human, slow, purposeful, metal against metal. I shouldn't leave. However, my curiosity was like a lens ready to catch the impossibly difficult. I twisted the handle. With every step creaking under my weight, the stairs sank in almost complete darkness. I was struck initially by the scent of salt water, moist metal, and something slightly burned, like overcooked wiring. I turned on the light on my camera. The steps descended in an impossible spiral. 50 steps, I counted. Then another 100. A passage ran ahead at the bottom. Fluorescent lights flickered and buzzed faintly, as though they were trying to light a room that didn't want to be there. On either side were doors, numbered, every single one of 101, 1302, and so on, repeating incessantly, as if the deck itself had looped. My name was called by a voice. Gentle, women. Tyler. I whirled. The corridor is deserted. Behind me, the floorboards creaked. At the far end, a shadow passed across a doorway. I raised my camera and focused on it. A woman with her hair stuck to her face stood there looking pallid. Although it was incorrect, her attire appeared to be that of the crew. Name tag scraped off, edges tattered. I ought to have gone back. I didn't. She disappeared as I approached. Only air. Violently, the lights flickered. Dozens of whispers were audible to me, including names, numbers, and some too low-pitched laughter to be friendly. My heart raced. The hallway in front of them twisted unnaturally. Doors that had been straight moments before now slanted slightly, leaning in unthinkable ways. At my feet there was a faint metallic rattle. I looked down. A key. Heavy. Brass, with 13 carved on it. I grabbed it. The temperature suddenly decreased. In front of me, my breath froze. The passage behind me moved once more. A door with a blank panel that I had not before noticed opened quietly. I wanted to go, but a voice whispered from inside. They're waiting for you. I dashed back upstairs. Rather than leading me out, the stairs continued to descend. Each twist led to a deeper place. Time was warped. Minutes stretched into hours, then rewound as my watch whirled wildly. The PA buzzed back. Deck 13 is not allowed. Unauthorized persons would be escorted. However, the tone was incorrect. It was almost mocking and mechanical. There was no crew, only me, the never-ending stairway, and the invisible travelers who muttered my name behind closed doors. I discovered that I had been using my camera to record the entire descent. I looked. White noise, twisted faces crushed against the screen, murmuring. Every frame was static, and even in the absence of light, the key shone, as though it were alive. I moved to 1307, a repeated door, and it creaked slowly open. The smell of rotting and salt filled the air. I had a sight of scores of passengers standing rigidly, their eyes vacant. They simply looked with their lips slightly open without moving. One turned to face me. It grinned. The brass key in my pocket would not go away. I felt a chill every time I touched it, even though its weight was almost reassuring. Now, the stairs I had climbed to get out felt like a recollection of a non-existent object. I made the decision to investigate more. Every door on Deck 13 kept repeating the same numbers. 1301, 1302, 1307 again, 1301, and so on. The door I had seen the passengers in, 1307, was the one I knocked on. I leaped back, heart pounding, as a voice inside murmured, "Tyler," just as my knuckles had barely brushed the metal. The whisper was layered this time, with several voices overlapping, like dozens of people talking at once.
One sounded like a scream, while others were my name, or timid appeal. Shadows danced over the walls under the flickering fluorescent lights. When I moved, the corridor seemed to pulse, growing longer. When I stopped, it shrank. Every playback frame was distorted, consisting only of static with flashes of pallid faces crushed against doors. Yet my camera captured it all. I decided I needed evidence. For everyone who might ever hear this. Not just for me. When I began recording voice memos and narrating everything, I had my first mid-story epiphany. If you're listening to this, please subscribe to Untold Happenings. I need the tale to be kept, if someone discovers this. Even though I realize it sounds ridiculous. The murmurs increased in volume. Light poured out from behind a door, at the far end, that I had never seen before. As before, a woman in a frayed crew uniform stood there. "You shouldn't be here," she whispered, her voice low and twisted, almost mechanical, as her eyes met mine. My question was, "Who are you? For what reason are they present?" Her head was tilted. "For you, Deck 13 does not exist. It never ends for us." I took a step back and noticed shadows moving behind each door. Doors that had been empty only moments before. Passengers whose faces had vanished days before were pressed against the glass panels. There was a crewman at the end of the corridor. However, his eyes were too vacant, and the uniform was too flawless. Without saying anything, he handed me a clipboard and disappeared. My name was written at the top of a manifest that was full of blank spaces. The fear hit me. I had been logged. I had been marked as present on a deck that shouldn't have been there by someone or something. As I turned to go, the hallway moved once more. Doors slid to one side. The walls bowed. Time was distorted. All of this was captured by my camera, however, the replay frames didn't match what I saw. Once more, static. There were faces in the windows that weren't there. I heard footsteps behind me. Something invisible was chasing me as I ran. I tripped and fell against the wall. I was transported back to 1307 by the faint gleam of the metal key in my pocket. This time, the door was ajar. I peered inside. In the dark water that had soaked through the floor, the previous passengers had multiplied and stood silently. Every face was waiting, staring blankly. I was horrified to discover that this was not a deck. It was a trap. A location that kept track on people and fed on any who ventured too far. I was becoming tired by that point. I squatted in a dark place and started filming. I told myself in a whisper, going over everything, because I was worried I might forget. Every noise in the hallway, including creaks, murmurs, and taps, was amplified. I had ringing in my ears. The ragged crewwoman reappeared somewhere down the corridor. She pointed to me and said, "Want to go? Grab the key. But keep in mind that it decides when you go." I gripped it. My heart pounded. I could either drop farther or risk vanishing forever into the deck. I decided to move forward. All I had was the brass key. No backup plan, and an increasing feeling of dread that enveloped me like a damp shroud. The hallway went on forever. It felt like the deck itself was restraining me with every move. Numbers repeated or skipped as doors on either side moved slightly. 1310, 1304, 1301. Once more, my head spun from the repetition. Then I caught sight of them. Travelers, gazing, quiet, pale faces, brushed up against doors, glass panes that weren't supposed to be there. Some of them I knew. People who had disappeared from the ship days before, even though they were strangers. There was the same void in their eyes. A man came up with a red luggage. He gave me a direct glance. There was no warmth in his smile, just a charge. "You're not supposed to be here." With my camera trembling in my hands, I staggered back. Every face was captured by the lens. Later, when I checked playback, they all flickered at once, frighteningly quickly, as if the deck itself were alive. I attempted to yell at them. "Who are you? What is this location?" No response, only the faint creaks, distant water drips, and the breathing of the deck.
My gut told me it was crucial when I noticed the slight glint of the key in my pocket. Occasionally, one of the doors, always 1307, opened a little by itself. Dark, thick water oozed from behind it, snaking toward me like a living creature. Once more, the murmurs began. Turn back, turn back, turn back. They insisted, more this time, and I disregarded them. The idea of turning around was like surrendering. Then I heard deliberate, unhurried footsteps behind me. I whirled. No one. But wherever I walked, I could hear someone, or several someones, moving in time with my heartbeat. I took off running. I discovered a bigger space, with weakly flashing light. The black, waist-high water reflected the warped hallway behind me. The passengers stood rigidly along the walls. Their eyes watched me without blinking, yet they remained motionless. As I approached, from the distant corner came a now clear voice. My sister. I rushed to her and said, "Tyler, don't look at them." Her hair was stuck to her moist face, and her eyes were wide with fear. I took her hand as she reached for me. She shivered and continued, "Listen to me. They don't let anyone go, so they keep us." Deck 13. The brass key clattered on the damp floor as it fell out of my pocket. Every passenger turned toward it at once. The air grew heavier. Something between water and metal vibrated low in the room. Time warped. Seconds snapped and stretched. Faces became hazy. Doors bent at unthinkable angles. I had to do something. I grabbed the key and hurried to the door with the number 1307 on it. I pressed it into the lock that I couldn't see. The door creaked, twisted, and opened to reveal an upward stairway made of normal wood, normal lighting, and normal appearance. I felt a wave of relief, but I knew deep down that nothing was ever regular on this deck. We took off running. I could hear them behind me. The low metallic moan, the whispering, the quiet, insistent footsteps. As Deck 13 attempted to drag us back, the water rose to our knees and sloshed. I sensed the deck bending and pushing. Finally, we exploded onto Deck 14. The panoramic windows let in the sun. Crew members walked by with fixed smiles, acting as though nothing was out of the ordinary. I fell against one of the railings. My sister gave me a trembling hug. "Is it gone, Tyler?" I gave a head shake. "I'm not sure. Doesn't it never truly go away?" The whispers continued to echo in my ears as we left. I could still feel the deck's gentle pressure as it bowed around me and waited in the back of my consciousness. Deep within the spacecraft, 3 distinct but barely audible knocks reverberated, and I had lost the brass key in my pocket. The bright hallways of the ship seemed to be a fiction. From someplace just out of sight, I could hear every creak and murmur as my sister clutched to my arm, shivering. All control had vanished along with the metal key that had guided us to Deck 13. We headed straight to guest services. As I described everything, the stairwell, the doors, the water, the passengers, the whispers, my voice faltered. The cashier gave a courteous smile. "Sir, this ship does not have Deck 13. My heart began race. My sister's horrified eyes grew wide. "You witnessed it. We all of us disappeared on that balcony." The clerk gave a head shake. "Maybe you're wrong, sir. Numbering the decks goes from 12 to 14. Nothing out of the ordinary here." A crew member passed behind her, eyes vacant, uniform flawless. I glimpsed faces crowded against walls and brief shadows that weren't there in the polished counter's reflection. "They're still there," I murmured to my sister. We departed guest services and made our way to the decks below. Each floor felt distorted and off. Stairs appeared longer. Doors repeated numbers in illogical ways, and hallways twisted subtly. The impact of Deck 13 seemed to radiate outward. The knocks then reached my ears. I heard 3 slow, purposeful knocks coming from the surrounding walls. My chest began to quiver with the sound. I went cold. The ragged crewwoman emerged from behind a maintenance door. Her gaze met mine. She remarked, "You brought them here." The deck remembers who arrives, but it makes its own decisions. Some depart. Most don't. I took a step back. "Where is my sister?" She gave a frigid, flat smile. "She's learning to stick around. You are too. The deck always gathers. Shadows rushed from each doorway before I could respond. We were approached by pale, silent figures. My sister let out a scream. I attempted to seize her, but the figures rushed by us, keeping us apart. Hours later, the key was back in my grasp. I gripped it tightly. My gut prompted me to utilize it, but the lock I had previously used to get out of the stairway was gone. The murmurs grew louder. "You are unable to depart. We hold off." We recall that the water rose once again, around our feet, knees, and passengers who were imprisoned had their faces squeezed together, their mouths slightly open and their eyes vacant. I tried phoning guest services, yelling for assistance and asking the captain, but to no avail. There was no sound from the PA system. The hallway wound in unimaginable geometries and went on forever. Then I understood that every action I did was in reverse. Every hallway I went by was the one I had just emerged from. The ship was being rewritten on deck, my sisters yelling, the icy water enveloping me, and the 3 slow, purposeful knocks that came simultaneously from everywhere and nowhere are the last things I recall before going black. I woke up in my cabin. Through the curtains came the morning brightness. There was no sign of my sister. The crew walked past, grinning and acting as if nothing had happened. On the pillow, the bronze key with the inscription 13 was resting. The knocks reverberated quietly in my skull when I touched it. I don't know whether Deck 13 ever existed outside of my vision, or if she's still on the ship. All I know is that I hear the voices every night as the ship creaks. The 3 knocks continue incessantly.